My name is Laura Dennis, and for case study 2, I did the reporting tragedy case. To give you some background on this particular case study, it involved reporter Stanley Foreman of the Boston Herald. He took several photos that day of a tragedy that involved the death of one of its victims. And one of these photos received a Pulitzer Prize. The photo sequence was printed in 128 U.S. newspapers, and it was also printed in several foreign countries. The pictures were released on July 22nd, 1975. The photos you see here are the real photos Foreman took while reporting on an apartment fire engulfed in flames. On a hunch, he decided to go around to the back of the burning building, and it was here he noticed the victims pictured on the 5th-story fire escape trapped. As firefighters attempted to rescue them from a hovering helicopter, the fire escape collapsed while Foreman captured these photos from below. It is here we are presented with an ethical dilemma. What are the victims' rights of a tragedy such as this one? Should they have protection from being photographed, from being interviewed? Although Foreman's instincts and resourcefulness enabled him to capture these photos, the exclusive nature of them should probably be a factor in whether or not they were run in the newspaper. Foreman even said that when he heard Bryant, one of the victims in the photo, had died, he assumed that the photos would not run. So the question is, should the death of one of the girls have affected the treatment of the photos? This tragedy affected many. First and foremost, the victims and their families. Of course, the 2-year-old girl and her 19-year-old godmother, the latter being the one who lost her life. These photos are a constant reminder to the 2-year-old at the time and her family, as well as the godmother's family. And it again makes me question whether they were notified before the photos were run in the paper or not. And I also believe that the others involved were truly affected, one of them being firefighter Bob O'Neill. He was the firefighter who was hovering overhead from the helicopter in an attempt to save both the girls' lives. And he had even stated that he'd only needed, 2 more seconds and he could have done that. So I imagine, him seeing these photos in the newspaper were very difficult for him as well. And then, of course, we have reporter Stanley Foreman, and he's affected in many ways, one being that he had no idea the photos were going to be run in the newspaper at all. So I think that was kind of unethical of the newspaper itself to not even notify Foreman, especially after hearing that Bryant, the 19-year-old, had passed. And it's going to be a constant reminder for him, as well as I would assume his Pulitzer Prize would be too. And then, of course, we have the publics, one being the media, and this goes back to, the media kind of having morality and ethics in their judgment and what is being printed and what's not. And I think this probably raised a lot of these questions and could have potentially affected how stories and pictures would have been printed in the future. but it also begs the question, why are we awarding a photographer for these photos when a victim's life has been lost? And then I also think this affected the general public, especially if you're a newspaper reader. I'm sure having that huge picture take up the whole first page, was very impactful on many. So the Potter box theory is a great way to break down one's ethical loyalties, principles, and values based on the definition of a particular situation. And here I've just given you kind of a visual so you can see what leads to what. And so we'll start with defining the situation, which we have already done. And so now we'll move on to the values, and that will lead us to principles as well as loyalties. So there are many ethical values at stake with tragedy reporting such as these, and having touched on what the book would consider the micro-range issues of this tragedy in regard to the victims, I'll move on to the bigger issues at stake. And as far as macro issues are concerned, I think the newspaper sacrificed moral and professional values in not only running these photos for what I would consider viewership or ratings, but also for the award given for the photo that was captured by reporter Stanley Foreman. And I think that's the larger issue here, because it's seen all the time. I mean, this isn't the first tragedy that was captured in pictures or even on film for that matter. And I think on a broader spectrum, it could be compared to, ISIS and their beheading videos, and is it ethical for people to watch those even though they're released? But here, being that it was printed in the newspaper and on the front page, if you're a newspaper reader, that's not something you really consider, and you don't really have the knowledge or the option to know, hey, what might I be looking at? Because it's on the front page. And I understand that comparison might be a little heavy, but these photos were still very, I'm sure, emotional for a lot of people, and I just don't think that was considered. And then, of course, we have some lesser, like, mid-range issues of professionalism and then newsworthiness. And that, I think, is just mainly in regard to newspapers outside of Boston running the photos. And that being a local issue. I mean, this story was local for Boston, and so I think they have that argument there, but the papers, that weren't even in the United States that ran the photos strictly for viewership, I think that was incredibly unethical, and those papers sacrificed some of their integrity, if not all of it. So, having concluded the ethical values of this particular case study, we can then move on to the ethical principles that it represents. And I think for this particular study, the actions best represent the theory of John Stuart Mill, which is seek the greatest happiness for the aggregate whole. And I say this because Mill contended that happiness was the sole end of human action and the test by which all conduct ought to be judged. He believed that preventing pain and promoting pleasure were the desirable ends. And so, that being said, we can take a step back and kind of see that, yes, maybe for the newspaper itself and those who might might benefit from these photos being released, whether it be financially or for fame or prizes and awards. I think they were looking at it from a perspective within the industry and not as a whole ethically. It's interesting to kind of see what perspective can do for your values and your principles and ultimately your loyalties. Moving on to ethical loyalties, and I think this is where things get a little sticky for the Boston Herald, specifically because I think they have some foundation in truth-telling. This was a local story, a local fire. It pertained to the public in that area, and ultimately that's their duty to the public, is truth-telling. And so I do think they have a bit of a foundation in running the story and the photos. However, that being said, I think it's kind of outweighed by the size of the photo and the way the photo was released, being that Foreman, the reporter, was not made aware of its printing until he saw it. So I do think they have a loyalty to truth-telling, but I think their main loyalties lie with viewership and awards and recognition. I think they knew this story was going to be big, and I think the photos presented a way for the Boston Herald to really gain readership or viewership. They knew people were going to be interested in talking about the fire and the lives lost. And then I also think their loyalties with awards and recognition stems from the fact that they could probably see the potential in Foreman's photos and knew that this had, the capacity for something big, and clearly it did. And so I think that they got what they were looking for. As far as the Boston Herald is concerned, I truly feel the only ethical duties they fulfilled were that of truth-telling and newsworthiness. Again, I think they had a foundation in sharing and publishing these photos and the story with the public because it was a local story and the public did have a right to know. However, that being said, I think the Boston Herald failed in all other aspects, as well as the other papers who ran and printed the photos. I think they should have had, more respect for the families and the lives lost. They could have shown a higher value of Bryant's life by respecting her family and gaining their permission before running the photos. I also think they failed professionally. I don't think they should have run the photos without Foreman's permission or notification, being that they were photos he took. And I just also feel they failed, morally to really show any type of remorse or regret for the victims and their families. And in doing so, they even capitalized on them by, winning these prizes, this Pulitzer Prize, and gaining this attention. So overall, I highly disagree with the choices made to run these photos and the foundation with which that choice was made.